Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soft, slow, and a little dusty in the best possible way. So if you're settling into bed, dim the lights, get cozy, and let your brain switch into low power mode. We're drifting back to an ancient world where the biggest communication drama wasn't an unread message, but whether your camel decided to keep walking or suddenly sit down because it was feeling exceptionally done with life. So, take a breath and sink into the desert air. Tonight, we're wandering through the Aksumite Empire, one calm footstep at a time. The Aksumites are one of history's favorite empires hiding in plain sight. Their kings stamped massive inscriptions, their merchants casually controlled Red Sea trade routes like it was a side hobby, and their architecture could best be described as, what if we stacked stones so high that even Rome would raise an eyebrow? But despite their monumental style, their daily life, especially their communication system, was astonishingly slow, quiet, and full of the type of logistical improvisation that would make any modern postal worker sigh in admiration. So let's settle into that, and float, very calmly, toward a system that kept a whole empire stitched together, using oversized desert mammals who were usually cooperative, unless they weren't. The Aksumite camel mail network wasn't a glamorous institution. Nobody carved a grand stela to brag about how many envelopes King Izana shipped last week. But behind the gold coins and diplomatic letters to Byzantium and Persia was a surprisingly elegant system of desert couriers, soft-eyed camels, and a rotating cast of officials whose job description was essentially walk long distances without dying. The empire itself stretched across northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, reaching into parts of Yemen when the mood, politics, and naval winds aligned. And to keep all that functioning, someone had to move messages. Yes, ancient delegations carried formal letters by ship, but on land, the camel was the quiet backbone of Aksumite bureaucracy. And those camels, for all their aloof charm, did more for regional stability than half the royal cousins who claimed they were very involved in administrative matters. The earliest Aksumite rulers aren't particularly chatty about their postal system. No one left behind a memo titled, Best Practices for Desert Communication. But we can piece things together from trade records, travel accounts, archaeological hints, and the deeply reliable historical method known as scholars squinting at evidence until something makes sense. And what emerges is an empire that ran a surprisingly organized courier network across the highlands and lowlands, linking caravans, tax stations, marketplaces, and royal centers. And yes, the camels were at the heart of it. Not because they were cute, though in a sleepy sort of way they are, but because the alternative was walking, and the Aksumites were practical people who had absolutely no interest in doing extra exertion if an animal could do the hot, sandy work instead. Camels had been in the region long before the Aksumite state fully formed. But Aksum mastered the art of using them not just for trade caravans, but for systematic message carrying. Think of them as the original desert Wi-Fi. Not fast, not always stable, but somehow still connecting everyone. A camel courier usually traveled with a small bundle of messages wrapped in leather or cloth, diplomatic letters, commercial records, tax instructions, or updates from provincial governors who wanted to sound very official even when nothing was happening. The messages themselves were often written on parchment or papyrus if you were fancy, or wooden tablets if you were practical, or ostraca, broken pottery shards, if you were thrifty. And knowing the frugal streak that runs through almost every ancient bureaucracy, quite a lot of Aksumite memos probably lived their entire careers on broken dishware. Imagine the scene. A dusty morning at an Aksumite waystation. A camel kneels, probably because it's feeling dramatic. A courier ties a message packet to the saddle, muttering something about how he hopes this camel doesn't spit on him today. And then the gentle sound of plodding footsteps begins, slow, rhythmic, and endless. Perfect for a sleep video, not so perfect if you were waiting on tax receipts from a stubborn governor 200 miles away. Each courier didn't travel alone. Stations dotted the main caravan routes, simple shelters made of stone or wood, with water troughs and enough shade to make a camel sigh in relief. These weren't luxurious rest stops. No one was serving roasted goat on porcelain plates. But they offered stability, water, fodder, a place to switch animals, and occasionally a scribe who served as the local information sponge. Messages moved in segments. One courier rode from Aksum to a station near Adulis. Another took over for the inland highland route. Another headed toward Yeha, and so on. In the highlands, camels sometimes struggled, so donkeys or mules took over. The Aksumites were nothing if not flexible. If an animal had legs and would move forward when coaxed, someone tried to make it an employee of the imperial postal system. And what about reliability? Well, let's say the Aksumite camel mail wasn't Amazon Prime. It was more like, your order will arrive between next week and 3 months, depending on whether the camel finds snacks along the way. This was an age when communication happened at the speed of mild inconvenience. And everyone accepted that. No one was refreshing a tracking page. If a royal decree took 6 weeks to reach a coastal official, that was simply how time worked. The universe was patient and very dusty, but for all its slowness, the system functioned. Traders moving along Red Sea routes relied on it. Governors counted on it. Priests and bishops used it to exchange theological letters that were far more heated than their writing styles suggested. And kings used it to maintain that delicate illusion that they were omnipresent, always aware of what their officials were doing, even if, realistically, they hadn't heard from half of them in months. The real magic was the camel drivers. These were the unsung heroes of the empire, men who knew the desert routes intimately, who could read wind patterns and sand textures, who could spot a mirage before an inexperienced traveler wandered right into one. They had a calm efficiency about them, born from walking the same roads again and again, carrying messages that were important to people who never thought much about the workers making it all possible. Royal scribes might brag about clever diplomacy, but none of that happened without a person who spent days humming to themselves in the desert while a camel chewed loudly behind them. Aksumite couriers also carried non-official messages, at least occasionally. Merchants paid extra to include a letter in the packet. Local families might send news to relatives in other regions, limited, quiet, modest messages. Nothing dramatic. Your cousin is still farming. Your uncle is still complaining. The goat situation is stable. That sort of thing. The camel carriers weren't glamorous figures. They rarely appear in surviving inscriptions. But their existence is carved into the landscape. Old paths, waystations, watering holes shaped into permanent points of human movement. A slow, steady heartbeat of communication across an empire that preferred things calm and predictable. After all, in Aksumite life, stability was worth more than speed. And the camel mail system reflected that philosophy perfectly. A typical courier day started early. Before the sun had warmed the stones, before the flies made their morning rounds. Aksumites valued the cool hours. The camel rose reluctantly, usually needing more encouragement than anyone else involved. Messages were checked. Water skins topped up. And then they moved, down from highland plateaus, across valleys dotted with acacia trees, into lowlands that shimmered with heat even by mid-morning. Travelers described the Ethiopian highlands as breathtaking, mountains swirling with clouds, terraced fields glowing green. But couriers didn't have time to admire scenery. They had a schedule, loosely defined by how much daylight remained and how cranky the camel felt. But still a schedule. Halfway through the day, the courier might pause at a small settlement. He'd take a sip of water, exchange a few words with locals, hear gossip about regional politics, probably pretend he cared deeply about the goat problems of the village chief. Then he'd hoist himself back onto the camel and continue the slow march, letting the rhythm of the animal's steps fade the world into something monotone and dreamlike. If the desert heat peaked, they might take a short break. Camels are resilient, but the couriers were human, and humans do not enjoy becoming raisins. Under a shaded acacia or rocky overhang, they waited until the sunlight softened. And then, back to walking. Always walking. Night travel happened only when absolutely necessary. The desert was quiet but not safe in the dark. So couriers preferred to sleep early. Light a small fire. Let the camel fold itself awkwardly into its preferred sleeping position. And let messages rest until the next sunrise. We don't have personal diaries from camel couriers, but if we did, they'd probably be the sleepiest writings in history. Just long sequences of walked today. Camel did not cooperate, delivered message. Someone gave me cheese. Tomorrow walking again. But despite the monotony, the system had rhythm. Predictability. Aksum thrived on that. Trade caravans flowed in and out of Adulis, the empire's main port, like a gentle tide of incense, ivory, spices, and gold. And behind each trade convoy, there were messages, instructions, negotiations, tax demands, polite threats disguised as diplomatic charm, all needing to move across hundreds of miles. The camel mail route tied the coast to the capital. It tied Ethiopia to Arabia. It tied villages to markets. And it tied an entire empire to the concept of slow but steady information flow. No drama, no urgency, just gentle communication drifting from one place to another, paced like a camel stroll. It reflected the Aksumite worldview, measured, stable, confident. When your empire controls trade routes and has enough wealth to mint gold coins with kings posing like Mediterranean emperors, you don't rush. Everything arrives eventually, and that quiet assurance flowed through the camel mail routes like a soft breeze. Chapter 2: The People Behind the Plodding Mail. The smooth functioning of Aksum's camel mail route depended less on grand imperial vision and more on the quiet, unglamorous people who nudged the entire system forward. Not the kings. Not the governors who pretended they personally ensured the empire stayed connected, but the ordinary and semi-ordinary figures who turned messages into movement. These were the carriers, the caravan masters, the scribes, the station keepers, and the administrators who lived knee-deep in paperwork long before paperwork became a modern curse. The Aksumite world, for all its monumental architecture and lively trade lanes, ran on a simple assumption. If someone was willing to walk long distances with a camel, the empire would survive. And because enough people were willing to do exactly that, the camel mail system kept humming along with a rhythmic calmness. Let's start with the camel drivers themselves. Not the caravan masters with impressive titles, but the quiet men who lived most of their lives in the open air, whose skin weathered into the kind of texture that could probably be used as topographical maps. These drivers were the backbone of the system. They weren't elite, they weren't rich, but they possessed a kind of patient endurance that made them indispensable. Aksumite camel drivers were chosen for their stamina, their knowledge of local landscapes, and, most importantly, their ability to remain calm when a camel decided it no longer wished to participate in civilization. That was a vital skill. Camels are notoriously expressive creatures, fond of grumbling, complaining, and occasionally making existential decisions mid-journey. It took a certain type of personality to greet a stubborn, kneeling camel with a sigh instead of despair. Drivers came from small villages, pastoral communities, market towns, and sometimes from families who had been involved in caravan work for generations. Their upbringing prepared them well. Many had grown up tending livestock, walking long distances to grazing grounds, and learning the basics of desert navigation from older relatives who could read the land as clearly as any written text. By the time they entered imperial service, they already moved through the landscape with the easy intuition of people who lived closer to the natural world than most administrators could ever understand. Despite their essential role, camel drivers weren't glorified. They earned modest pay, food rations, grain allowances, small payments in coin or goods. But they valued the stability. Being a courier or driver meant steady work, predictable routes, and, occasionally, small perks like sleeping in waystations instead of under the open sky. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. In an ancient empire where life could shift quickly due to droughts, war, or shifting trade winds, dependable work mattered. Above the drivers were the caravan masters. These were the managers of the desert highways, men with more responsibility, better pay, and the steady confidence of people who knew every caravan depended on their judgment. A caravan master coordinated routes, ensured supplies were stocked, negotiated permissions when crossing other communities' lands, and made sure each driver had an animal that wasn't about to collapse halfway through the journey. Many caravan masters were former drivers who moved up the hierarchy after demonstrating competence. They weren't chosen for charisma or political connections. They were chosen because they knew how to get caravans across long, empty distances without losing half the animals or all the patience of the men involved. And then there were the scribes, arguably the most meticulous people in the whole system. Scribes appeared everywhere in the Aksumite bureaucracy, at royal courts, at marketplaces, at waystations, in monasteries, anywhere information needed to be captured, duplicated, or supervised. These scribes were trained in the art of guizi writing, a script that looked beautiful, orderly, and very committed to the idea that paperwork should exist in every era of history. Aksumite scribes weren't flashy intellectuals writing philosophical treatises. They were practical record keepers. Their goal was simple: ensure that instructions passed along camel routes didn't get lost, blurred, or mangled. A typical scribe's day involved copying messages, sealing packets with wax or clay, verifying sender names, confirming destinations, and occasionally reading out orders to drivers who were illiterate. Their handwriting was precise. Their ink was often homemade. Their desks were usually nothing more than wooden boards balanced on stone blocks. Yet the empire rested heavily on their quiet discipline. Scribes also kept logs of message arrivals and departures, what modern bureaucrats might call tracking information, except without barcodes or scrolling delivery maps. These logs helped royal administrators understand how fast messages were moving, which routes were efficient, and which station keepers were falling behind schedule. If a station had a reputation for losing messages, a new keeper was quietly appointed. No drama, no announcements, just a smooth, silent administrative adjustment. Station keepers, in turn, were the custodians of the mail route's infrastructure. They maintained shelters, tended water troughs, distributed fodder, and ensured animals were rotated properly. They lived at crossroads of movement, far from major cities, but close to the slow beat of the empire's pulse. Their daily routine was modest. Wake up, check water levels, inspect the shade structures, organize any outgoing messages, feed any lingering camels, wait for the next courier. Some station keepers lived with their families. Others lived alone. Many kept small gardens or herded goats in the hours between caravan arrivals. Their work wasn't intense, but it required reliability. A station keeper who forgot to refill the water trough could delay half a week's worth of mail. And in an empire where patience was expected but not limitless, that was not ideal. Above these layers sat the imperial bureaucracy. It wasn't massive, Aksum wasn't China or Persia, but it was structured. The king appointed officials responsible for overseeing the flow of messages between provinces. These officials drafted orders, set regulations for caravan movements, and monitored long-distance communications. They weren't involved in day-to-day camel management. Their world lived in the realm of decrees, seals, and administrative tidiness. One particularly important figure was the royal messenger overseer, a position that combined coordination, logistics, and the general expectation that if something went wrong, it was probably his fault. He reported directly to higher officials or even to the king, depending on the era. His job involved reviewing message logs, planning long-distance courier routes, and ensuring that the system served both state and commercial needs. This oversight wasn't heavy-handed. Aksum's administration preferred light pressure. As long as messages flowed, nobody felt the need to reinvent the system. But during moments of increased diplomatic activity or trade surges, supervision tightened. More scribes were assigned, additional camels requisitioned, routes reinforced, and when the busy period passed, everything eased back into its sleepy rhythm. The people behind the system came from diverse backgrounds. Some were highland farmers accustomed to terraced fields and cool air. Others were lowlanders who understood the desert intimately. Some came from merchant families who had moved goods for generations. Others came from communities focused on herding and pastoral life. This diversity gave the system resilience. Different routes required different kinds of expertise, and the empire drew from a wide pool of regional skills. Communication between these groups wasn't dramatic. It was steady. Caravan masters left notes for scribes. Scribes left instructions for station keepers. Station keepers passed oral messages to drivers. Drivers delivered messages to provincial officials. And those officials, often aristocratic men who believed deeply in their own importance, sent back new packets of neatly folded parchment or wooden tablets. These provincial officials added their own personality to the system. Some were diligent, some were proud. Some wrote excessively long letters about extremely minor issues, believing that length signaled importance. Others barely wrote at all, sending only brief updates like "Harvest acceptable," "Roads clear," nothing else. Their writing styles varied, but their dependence on the camel mail did not. The camel mail system also connected Aksum to the kingdom of Himyar across the Red Sea, especially during periods when the two states enjoyed warmer relations. Camel drivers might carry packets to ports where ships would take messages to Arabian officials. The same routes also carried religious correspondence, particularly after Christianity spread through the empire. Clergy, bishops, and monasteries relied on steady communication to coordinate festivals, doctrinal discussions, and donations. This layered network of people, drivers, scribes, caravan masters, keepers, administrators, created a structure that was simple in design but effective in practice. No one part overshadowed the others. It was a collaborative system shaped by long tradition and quiet competence. What kept these people motivated wasn't grand imperial pride. It was routine, stability, predictability. The camel mail system offered all three. A driver knew his route. A station keeper knew his duties. A scribe knew his tools. Each person settled into the slow rhythm of the empire, contributing one small piece to a larger, steady process. Even mishaps were handled calmly. A delayed delivery? It happened. A camel wandered off? Someone found it eventually. A packet damaged in a river crossing? Scribes rewrote it if they could. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was panicked. The system was designed for flexibility, not perfection. The human relationships embedded in this network were equally gentle. Drivers exchanged news with station keepers. Caravan masters shared meals with scribes. Officials thanked couriers when particularly important letters arrived. These interactions built a sense of quiet community along the desert highways. The system also offered a form of social mobility. A diligent driver might become a caravan master. A clever station keeper might be promoted into the administrative world. A gifted scribe might earn a place in the royal chancery. Aksum was hierarchical, but it wasn't sealed. The mail system gave ordinary people a pathway, slow, sandy, but real. As we ease deeper into the story, the picture becomes clearer. An empire built not on speed, but on cooperation. A system shaped by people who understood that steady footsteps accomplish more than rushed ones. The camel mail route wasn't a grand technological leap. It was a carefully maintained tradition carried forward by generations. Without these people, the empire would have fragmented into scattered provinces drifting through silence. With them, it held together, connected, calm, and always just a little dusty. Chapter 3: Daily Life Along the Camel Roads. Daily life in the Aksumite Empire unfolded in a rhythm that matched its camel roads, steady, predictable, and built on routines that rarely rushed. The mail routes weren't isolated corridors used only by couriers. They were arteries of everyday activity. Farmers, merchants, priests, herders, diplomats, gossiping travelers, and bored teenagers tagging along on errands all moved along these paths in loops of slow but constant motion. And because the camel mail passed through the same spaces, it shaped how settlements grew, how markets formed, and how information drifted through the empire. Aksum's landscape offered a mix of highland coolness and lowland heat, giving different regions their own flavors of daily life. Highland communities rose around terraces, churches, and grain fields. Lowlanders lived among acacia groves, dry riverbeds, and long stretches of desert pasture. Yet both worlds were connected by the same dusty roads and the same expectation that messages, religious, administrative, commercial, would float through the region every few days. In the highlands, life moved to the pace of farming cycles. Early mornings filled with the soft sounds of cattle bells and tools scraping soil. Farmers grew barley, wheat, teff, and pulses, and their harvest seasons were major social events. Even though mail carriers weren't directly tied to farming, their schedules often intersected with agricultural tasks. A courier passing through a highland village during harvest usually received a humble meal, bread, a cup of milk, maybe dried meat. Not out of generosity, but because Aksumite hospitality demanded it. And any traveler, especially one moving messages, was treated as a temporary member of the household. These villages weren't quiet in the sense of being empty. They were quiet in the sense of being predictable. You could walk through one at midday and see the same patterns repeating everywhere. Women preparing grain, elders sitting under shaded trees, children following goats, blacksmiths hammering iron, and a scribe sitting near the village chapel copying religious texts. When a courier arrived, no one reacted with surprise. They simply looked up, nodded, and returned to their tasks. The camel might receive more attention than the driver, usually because camels were amusingly unpredictable and good at making dramatic faces for no reason at all. Lowland settlements, on the other hand, depended heavily on pastoral life. Herds of cattle, goats, sheep, and camels grazed under wide skies. Families lived in clusters of homes made of stone or wood, often near wells or seasonal rivers. Water shaped everything. A station near a reliable well naturally grew into a social hub. Not a big town, just a place where people knew travelers would stop. And where travelers stopped, small markets appeared, offering dates, butter, incense, salt, woven baskets, and whatever else villagers had in surplus that week. The camel mail system wove all these communities together. Even people who never received an official message still felt the effects. When the mail packet arrived at a local station, it brought news. Maybe a decree from Aksum. Maybe a report from a governor. Maybe a letter from a merchant's relative. And maybe, if someone felt bold, an informal note tucked inside asking for updates about a marriage, a trade deal, or a sick family member. These informal messages weren't entirely official, but they weren't forbidden. Aksumite administrators understood that humans need communication. And since the camel was already going that way, refusing to carry a small extra note felt unnecessary. The arrival of a mail packet also meant the arrival of information about regional events. News moved slowly but reliably. People heard about disputes between noble families, droughts in distant provinces, market prices shifting along the Red Sea, or which king was currently claiming to be descended from Solomon, because that happened more often than anyone expected. These bits of news seeped gradually into local conversations. By evening, elders would sit under the stars discussing which parts were probably true, which parts were exaggerated, and which parts were created entirely by someone who had run out of real stories. Markets along the camel routes served as hubs of exchange far beyond goods. You could find merchants from coastal towns selling imported Roman pottery, Arab traders offering spices or fabric, and highland farmers bartering butter, honey, or grain. Each of these people carried stories. Each had opinions about politics, weather, or camel behavior. And as these conversations drifted across the market, the camel mail system amplified them. Because the same people who sold goods also relied on the mail carriers for long-distance communication. In some markets, the scribe of the station might sit beneath an awning, offering letter-writing services. Not everyone could write Gizi well enough to send a formal note. And even those who could often preferred a scribe's clean, official handwriting, especially if the message concerned taxes, property disputes, or trade contracts. These scribes wrote patiently, listening to long-winded explanations from clients who insisted on including every unnecessary detail. A typical session might begin with a merchant saying, "Write that I am well," followed by an hour-long recounting of every goat he sold that month. The scribe remained calm. It was part of the job. Religious life also shaped daily rhythms along the routes. Churches and monasteries dotted the highlands, and their activities influenced how people perceived time. Priests needed messages delivered about festivals, donations, or theological debates. Monasteries requested manuscripts, discussed doctrine, and coordinated with distant spiritual communities. The camel mail wasn't a sacred institution, but it supported sacred communication, and that made it quietly respected. Many priests developed friendly relationships with couriers. They offered blessings before long journeys, simple, softly spoken ones. The kind that didn't promise miracles, but offered comfort. Travelers appreciated the gesture. Even a camel might look slightly calmer after a blessing, though this was probably coincidence rather than divine intervention. Royal courts relied on the mail system just as much as rural communities did. Court life in Aksum was structured, formal, and rich with protocol. Nobles kept households full of attendants, servants, and hangers-on who all had slightly different interpretations of what counted as urgent business. The king presided over councils, religious ceremonies, and diplomatic receptions. But behind every proclamation lay a network of scribes drafting documents, sealers stamping wax, and messengers preparing to leave. Inside the royal chancery, life revolved around writing. Tables stacked with wooden tablets, parchment scrolls, and storage jars filled with ink created in organized chaos. Officials dictated letters meant for distant governors. Scribes copied royal orders in beautiful handwriting. Clerks arranged the messages into packets. And somewhere in the corner, a supervisor tried to ensure no one misplaced anything important. In an era without copies or digital backups, one lost tablet could cause days of mild bureaucratic discomfort. When a packet was ready, a messenger carried it from the chancery to the mail station in the capital. There, drivers checked their routes and prepared their camels. Some messages traveled only a short distance, to nearby markets or religious centers. Others journeyed across provinces, toward coastal towns or remote valleys. The people receiving these messages lived lives shaped by responsibility and hierarchy. Provincial governors, for example, often lived in fortified residences surrounded by fields and grain stores. Their days followed predictable patterns: hearing petitions, managing local disputes, inspecting tax records, and occasionally hosting visiting dignitaries. Messages from Aksum influenced everything they did. A single decree might change tax rates, shift trade routes, or request troops for a distant campaign. Governors depended on these messages, and they relied on the camel mail to deliver them with minimal fuss. Their households mirrored miniature courts. Scribes, servants, guards, and advisors populated their compounds. When the mail arrived, the household stirred slightly, nothing dramatic, just a gentle ripple of activity. A scribe unsealed the packet. Messages were read aloud. An advisor nodded thoughtfully, pretending to understand every detail. The governor issued brief instructions. And by late afternoon, everything returned to its normal rhythm. Merchants depended on the system just as deeply. Trade networks ran through Aksum like threads connecting distant regions. Goods moved across highlands, lowlands, deserts, and seas. And messages accompanied them: price updates, shipping instructions, warnings about bandits, or simple notes confirming whether a shipment of incense actually reached its destination. Aksumite merchants were practical people. They disliked surprises. A reliable, predictable mail system helped reduce uncertainty, even if it didn't eliminate it entirely. Families also used the routes for personal communication. These letters weren't dramatic. They contained everyday concerns, quiet hopes, and gentle updates. A mother might write to a married daughter living in a distant village. A son working in a coastal town might send news about trade opportunities. A farmer might share updates about a relative's illness. Nothing exciting, but these messages threaded emotional continuity into the empire. They softened distances. Travelers encountered the camel mail constantly. You might be walking to a nearby village, carrying grain to a market, and suddenly see a courier approaching in the distance. Dust rising behind a camel, the courier's posture relaxed from long hours on the road. Travelers stepped aside respectfully, not because of fear or authority, but because the courier carried something important to someone, somewhere, and everyone understood that. The mail routes also influenced settlement patterns. Villages tended to form near water sources, trade paths, or religious centers. When a mail station existed nearby, the settlement gained a quiet sense of importance. People knew officials passed through. News arrived sooner. Goods moved more regularly. Small inns appeared, offering basic lodging to travelers. Market days expanded slightly, drawing merchants from neighboring areas. None of this turned a village into a metropolis, but it shaped its identity. One of the most interesting aspects of daily life along the routes was the shared understanding of time. People didn't measure days by hours and minutes. They measured them by light, weather, and distance. A message wasn't expected tomorrow morning. It was expected after a few days, or when the courier passes through on his return, or before the next festival. This flexible sense of time reduced anxiety. No one waited by a roadside. No one asked for tracking updates. Messages arrived when they arrived. And life adjusted accordingly. The camel mail system also brought predictability to taxation. Farmers knew when officials would request records. Market sellers knew when tax collectors would appear. Governors knew when reports were due. The entire bureaucratic rhythm depended on these slow-moving packets drifting across the landscape. And because people trusted that the system would work, eventually, everyone planned around it. Daily life along the camel roads created a sense of gentle interdependence. The empire wasn't held together by force or speed. It was held together by routine, by a shared acceptance that communication was a slow but steady river running through every community. People trusted the system not because it was flawless, but because it was consistently adequate. And sometimes that was enough. Chapter 4. The couriers who refuse to be impressed by anything. If you've ever met someone who is completely unbothered by chaos, like the barista who calmly makes your latte while a blender explodes behind them, you already understand the spiritual vibe of an Aksumite imperial courier. These were men who spent weeks at a time drifting across deserts, hills, valleys, and occasionally other people's political problems, all while maintaining an expression that basically said, okay. They were, in a word, steady. Purposefully steady. Steady to the point where later Arabic chroniclers described them as silent shadows on the horizon, which sounds poetic and also a little like a mild insult, but we'll take it. Let's drift into their world. The first thing to know is that Aksumite messengers weren't just random camel owners who happened to wander by the palace. They were vetted. Not with paperwork. Aksum wasn't into bureaucracy for its own sake, but with reputation. Aksumite officials loved reputation. If you'd ever successfully crossed a desert without dying, or navigated a feud between two testy village elders without getting yelled at, or delivered a sealed tablet without reading it first, you were considered unusually exceptional and unusually valuable. Being a courier in the Aksumite Empire meant you were automatically plugged into a web of obligations: clan, emperor, regional governors, priests, temple scribes, and the occasional merchant cooperative. It sounds messy, but to them it was the gentle rhythm of life. Their job wasn't just to move messages. It was to maintain the giant, humming, interconnected social organism that kept the empire functioning slowly, steadily, and without surprises. Surprises were deeply discouraged. Most couriers began their training young. Not child labor young, but more like your uncle thinks you should start learning how not to fall off a camel young. It usually began with shadowing an older messenger on the shorter routes, those little local loops between towns like Yeha, Madara, and Adulis. These beginners learned three strangely important things. How to read camel moods. Camels have a face that is 70% disdain, 20% exhaustion, and 10% mild curiosity. The trick was knowing which expression meant, "I will walk peacefully today," and which meant, "I will sit down now for 3 hours and reconsider my existence." Young couriers became experts in interpreting tiny flicks of camel ears, tail twitches, or the specific angle of an unimpressed huff. How to carry messages without bending, cracking, or accidentally sweating on them. Aksumite writing tablets weren't delicate, but they also weren't indestructible. The clay ones enjoyed breaking at the worst times. The parchment ones didn't like humidity. The wooden ones were heavy and enjoyed bruising ribs. So novices learned a whole choreography of binding straps, padded pouches, and slings designed to keep everything stable even when you were bouncing along a ridge at dusk. How to hold your tongue. This one mattered most. Couriers often overheard things, or delivered messages that resulted in local drama. Sometimes heated drama. The wise courier smiled politely, said absolutely nothing, and left before the real argument started. It was a survival skill as essential as water. Once they proved they could survive the smaller circuits without losing a tablet, a camel, or their sanity, couriers graduated to the imperial routes. And these were a different universe. The stretch between Aksum and the port city of Adulis alone passed through microclimates that changed every half day. Slopes filled with hyena calls. Plateaus where the wind behaved like a judgmental ant, always complaining and never stopping. Sharp, rocky paths where hooves slipped in the same places every time, almost like the rocks were playing practical jokes. The couriers didn't complain. They considered it a mildly amusing challenge. And then, once they reached Adulis, they entered a city buzzing with marine trade, foreign visitors, sailors who were absolutely convinced they discovered new winds, and local merchants holding 5 conversations at once. To the couriers, it all sounded like someone had set the volume too high. So they did the natural thing. They delivered their packets, accepted some water, avoided being dragged into long-winded trade stories, and left. Efficiency was their sacred art. It's surprisingly soothing to imagine the slow pace of their work. Aksumite communication didn't expect the instant replies we're used to. A message might take days, weeks, or even a month to return depending on terrain. No one panicked. No one demanded urgent clarification. The empire moved with the rhythm of natural geography. And because of that, couriers became masters of timing, not fast timing, but accurate timing. They understood when the afternoon winds rose along certain ridges, when the fog settled over the highlands, when riverbeds shifted after unpredictable rain. They built a mental map of sound and light, like an internal clock that ticked in landscape cues rather than minutes. One courier once told a visiting chronicler that he could tell the time by the way shadows crept across a particular boulder near the banks of a tributary. That chronicler wrote it down in his notes with mild awe. The courier, meanwhile, probably didn't understand why this impressed anyone. To him, it was normal. Perhaps the most calming detail about their lifestyle was their attitude toward danger. They acknowledged it, but with the same energy someone has when acknowledging a slightly wobbly chair. Yes, it might collapse eventually. No, it wasn't worth panicking about. Bandits existed, of course. But they avoided couriers because couriers traveled in predictable rhythms. Predictability is often safer than speed. Also, the empire was not amused when someone interfered with its messages. That discouragement tended to echo across the landscape. As for wildlife, hyenas were loud but rarely curious. Leopards preferred easier meals. And camels were deeply uninterested in drama. The desert, however, was the biggest challenge, particularly heat. But couriers adapted with almost monk-like discipline. They traveled early, rested midday, wrapped their heads in layered cloth that created tiny personal wind tunnels. They drank water like it was an art form. And they always knew where the nearest well, cistern, or seasonal pool was located. Some had entire mental libraries of sacred, backup water spots. They rarely used them. They just liked knowing they existed. It was comforting. One ongoing mystery, asleep historians love these, is how couriers stayed awake during long rides. The trick wasn't coffee. They didn't have that yet. It wasn't singing. That requires enthusiasm, which is the opposite of what they aimed for. It wasn't dramatic storytelling, because again, too lively. Instead, they used something modern people might call moving meditation. A steady rhythmic awareness, hoofbeats, breathing, shifting weight, the creak of leather straps. The body relaxed, the mind drifted gently, but never fully let go. You exist in a floating state, alert enough to steer a camel but calm enough to forget time. If that sounds like the perfect setup for a sleep video, that's because it basically is. Another part of what made couriers so essential was their relationship with lodging stations and safe houses across the empire. These weren't grand inns. More like structured waypoints, stone enclosures, fenced paddocks, shade structures, sometimes a family home quietly serving as a rest hub. These families often treated couriers like distant relatives. Water was always refilled first. Camels always fed before humans. A meal was offered without fanfare. And in return, couriers brought outside news, but filtered news, calm, understated, and never gossipy. If something dramatic had happened, they'd mention it with great softness. Yes, apparently a merchant fell off a wagon this week. But he survived. Just dusty. There was an argument in the market. They resolved it. Their entire worldview avoided escalation. Even chaos sounded like a mild inconvenience when described by them. At night, couriers slept wherever they could, folded cloaks on smooth stones, padded saddles repurposed as pillows, or the shade of a thorn tree. Their camels rested nearby, grumbling occasionally, because camels always have something to say. The stars above the Aksumite highlands are often described as unusually crisp, so clear that later travelers wrote about them as if they were lanterns hung by careful hands. A courier lying in the cool dark would watch those stars shift through the night, half awake, half drifting, waiting for dawn to tint the horizon. They weren't philosophers, at least not formally, but many of them developed a soft, observational wisdom, the kind that comes from watching mountains fade into mist or hearing the same winds move through the same valleys year after year. One courier, recorded by a monk centuries later, said something beautifully low-key. "Roads do not hurry. They wait. I follow." That's the Aksumite courier mindset in one quiet line. And because they didn't hurry, they rarely made mistakes. Messages arrived when they were supposed to. Seals remained unbroken. Rumors stayed unspread. And camels, miraculously, did not wander off. Governors trusted them. Priests respected them. Merchants relied on them. Even emperors, who generally didn't treat anyone as essential except themselves, treated their couriers with a subtle reverence. Not admiration, just recognition. Chapter 5. The quiet logistics of an empire that liked things unhurried. If you picture ancient imperial logistics as something loud, frantic, and vaguely smoky, like a stressed-out Roman official yelling at dockworkers, you'll need to gently set that image aside. The Aksumite Empire preferred its logistics the way it preferred its architecture: calm, solid, and not interested in anyone's emotional outbursts. Aksumite administrators treated efficiency like a soothing philosophy. They didn't bark orders, they hummed through them. So when we slide into the deeper machinery behind the camel mail system, the planners, the scribes, the coordinators, what we find is a surprisingly tranquil world. It's like discovering that the people responsible for moving critical government messages across thousands of miles spent most of their day in a state of mild, contemplative peace. If you've ever worked in an office where the slowest employee is also somehow the most productive, consider this your historical parallel. Let's begin with the scribes. Aksumite scribes were the quiet backbone of every message. They had the extremely delicate task of preparing documents so they could survive long-distance travel without cracking, fading, or turning into an unreadable piece of dust the moment someone sneezed near it. These scribes worked in shaded side rooms of administrative complexes, surrounded by tablets, inks, styluses, parchment strips, and an atmosphere that was equal parts dust and dignity. They wrote slowly, deliberately. Aksumite script, flowed in elegant lines, a writing system that looked ancient even when it was ancient. Watching a scribe work must have been hypnotic. Some of them even developed subtle wrist techniques to reduce smudging, like a gentle rocking motion that made every stroke look like it was gliding across the page. The empire wasn't obsessed with absolute calligraphic perfection, but it did expect messages to be legible upon arrival. That was the primary goal. Fancy handwriting was optional. Clear handwriting was sacred. Once a scribe finished a document, the next step wasn't dramatic. There were no royal trumpets or bustling clerks snatching packets from workbenches. A senior scribe simply inspected the tablet or parchment, approved it with a tiny nod, and placed it into a small wooden chest or clay vessel meant for outgoing dispatches. Here's a charming detail. The containers themselves were padded, soft leather strips, braided fibers, or cloth bundles designed to absorb shocks. Imagine sending your email cushioned inside a tiny pillow. That was basically the Aksumite approach. Protection over speed. Preservation over pomp. A message was precious not because of its content, which might only be a governor complaining about grain taxes, but because of the distance it still had to travel to reach its destination. Next we drift to the dispatch overseers, the calmest micromanagers in ancient Africa. They were responsible for coordinating courier schedules, and they did it with the relaxed patience of someone arranging stones in a garden. Their job required a quiet mental map of timing, geography, and camel temperament. Instead of rushing couriers out the moment a message was ready, they considered wind patterns. Some sections of the highlands became a wind tunnel after midday. Couriers leaving too late risked dealing with gusts that could knock a tablet right out of its pouch. Camel moods. A camel in a rebellious state could ruin an entire dispatch timeline. If a camel wasn't feeling the journey that day, planners simply waited. Fighting a camel is a battle no human has ever won. Climate cycles. Certain valleys flooded after morning rains. Certain roads baked into heat traps after noon. Departure times were a balancing act. And so, dispatch overseers practiced a slow negotiation with the landscape. A gentle dance. A kind of bureaucratic yoga. They finalized decisions with tiny gestures. A tilt of the hand, a nod, a finger placed thoughtfully on a route marker carved into a wooden planning board. Nothing was rushed. Everything was deliberate. Once the courier was cleared to depart, they received a briefing. And these briefings were beautifully understated. 2 days north. Rest at the high spring. Watch for loose stones near the ridge. Deliver this to the governor. He is in a contemplative mood. Do not offer opinions. There were no scrolls of regulations. No dramatic motivational speeches. Just simple reminders spoken in calm voices. Even warnings were toned down to the softest possible level. There have been hyenas on the Western Trail. They should be uninterested if you remain calm. Remain calm. The default state of the Aksumite courier. Now let's glide into the geography itself, because it shaped the logistics as much as any official did. The Aksumite Empire stretched across highlands, lowlands, desert plains, and coastal zones along the Red Sea. Each region imposed its own quiet rules. Couriers, and the administrators who supported them, knew these rules intimately. The highlands. This was the empire's beating heart. Mountains, ridges, cool breezes, and paths that looped like thoughtful spirals. Travel was stable here. Predictable. The highland stations were well supplied, often run by families who had served the empire for generations. Couriers liked highland travel best. The air was comfortable. The roads were familiar. The nights were cool enough for deep, satisfying sleep. The lowlands. These were warm, dry stretches where the heat rose in shimmering waves and the horizon melted into soft blurs. Travel here required slow pacing and hydration discipline. Lowland stations often kept deep cisterns, carefully maintained, covered from the sun, and treated like communal treasures. Couriers tended to move like shadows across these plains. Quiet, methodical, unbothered. The desert edges. Not full deserts, but transitional zones where sand met scrubland. These areas were windy, and sand could slip into message containers if not sealed correctly. Couriers used additional wrapping here, cloth tied in careful folds around their dispatch bundles. Administrators scheduled desert edge travel during seasons when temperatures were manageable. Messages were never urgent enough to justify heatstroke. The coastal road to Adulis. This was the lively path. Bustling. Full of chatter, traders, caravans, wandering goats, sailors loudly describing their excellent navigation instincts, and the occasional ship captain arguing with a palm tree for shade. Couriers moved through all this noise like monks walking through a festival. Focused, polite, detached. Behind the scenes, Aksumite logistics depended on resource management, especially water and fodder. This wasn't a resource-rich system. It was a resource-efficient one. The empire strategically placed wells, cisterns, and small granaries along its major roads. Many were so old that later travelers assumed they must have been built by mythical kings. But no, just Aksumite planners with a quiet love of reliability. Couriers rarely carried large amounts of water. They didn't need to. The stations were close enough that a steady pace brought them from one source to the next without strain. It wasn't a race. It was a rhythm. If a station ran low on supplies, messengers relayed subtle notes back to planners. Nothing dramatic, just, the grain basket is light. The southern trough is dry today. These small remarks flowed up the administrative chain, prompting gentle but steady responses, a restock, a repair, a reinforcement. No fanfare, just maintenance as meditation. One fascinating element of Aksumite logistical culture was their concept of travel silence. This wasn't a formal rule, more like a shared understanding. Couriers spoke little on the road. Even when traveling in groups for mutual safety, they kept conversations sparse, soft, and spaced out. Speaking too much disrupted pacing, disrupted attention, disrupted the quiet mental space that made long-distance travel bearable. If they did speak, it was often about environmental cues. The wind has shifted. The ground is firm today. There may be rain by sunset. Everything was rooted in awareness, not emotion. No dramatic storytelling. No gossip explosions. Just soft, factual notes. It created a serene, dreamy atmosphere, days of slow movement paired with the almost meditative silence of small, necessary remarks. Of course, not every courier shared the exact same temperament. Some were more expressive. Some made jokes. Some enjoyed telling mild stories at night. But even then, the tone remained low-key. One traveler recorded a courier attempting humor after a long day. "These rocks dislike my feet." That was the entire joke. And everyone laughed softly, because that counted as a big punchline by courier standards. Administrators also had their own culture, full of quietly competitive habits. Some kept detailed travel charts, measuring average courier times across seasons. Some made careful notes comparing camel breeds for endurance, temperament, and stubbornness. Some experimented with new packing techniques for message bundles, trying to find the perfect balance between protection and flexibility. But no one bragged about these innovations. They simply implemented them, observed results, and adjusted. Improvement through modesty. If someone's idea worked exceptionally well, colleagues praised it with understated enthusiasm. Yes, that is very good. Which, in Aksumite bureaucratic language, was basically a standing ovation. What might be most calming about the entire logistical system is that it accepted the natural pace of the world. Aksum didn't try to outrun geography. It aligned itself with it. Instead of forcing couriers into impossible deadlines, they scheduled routes according to terrain rhythms and camel needs. Instead of rushing messages for political drama, they allowed the land to set the tempo. As a result, the empire's communication network became one of the most stable in the region, steady, dependable, almost soothing in its predictability. Nothing flashy, nothing hurried. The Aksumite Empire is one of those civilizations where the roads were less civil-engineered marvels and more suggestions the landscape politely allowed. If you're imagining Roman-style stone highways stretching across North Africa, neat, geometric, aggressively straight, Aksum would like to gently tap you on the shoulder and whisper, "No thank you." Their roads were quieter, softer, blended into the world instead of dominating it. And somehow, this made them incredibly effective for the slow, steady rhythm of camel mail. Let's drift through these unassuming arteries of empire. Aksumite roads started as footpaths, ancient tracks worn into the land by shepherds, traders, and people who just wanted to get somewhere without thinking too hard about it. Over centuries, these paths widened, hardened, and became official without anyone ever holding a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Aksum didn't do ribbon-cutting. Too dramatic. Engineers, if we can call them that, worked with very gentle intervention, removing loose boulders, flattening awkward ledges, adding drainage grooves where rain liked to misbehave, laying down packed gravel in swampy months, shaping narrow terraces on mountain slopes. Nothing flashy, nothing that required shouting. The goal was simply to make travel predictable. Predictability was the backbone of Aksumite communication. Couriers didn't need speed, they needed consistency. A path that was always the same was worth more than a masterpiece of construction that required constant repair. So the roads became living things, shifting slightly with seasons, settling over time, adapting to erosion with minimal maintenance but maximum familiarity. Walk them once and you knew their personality. Walk them for 20 years and you knew their moods. One of the loveliest things about these routes is that they doubled as social lines. Villages would gently form around bends in major paths, not crowded, not chaotic, just clusters of households that grew like moss along a tree trunk. These settlements provided fodder, quiet company, not inns, not markets. Just little pockets of human presence where a courier could rest in the shade of a sycamore tree and sip water that tasted like dust and minerals and faint sweetness. Some families became unofficial guardians of particular stretches of road. They weren't paid. They weren't appointed. They just were there, generation after generation, pruning overhanging branches, clearing debris after seasonal storms, and greeting travelers with calm nods. Travelers repaid them by bringing news, even if the news was delightfully uneventful. Yes, the river is lower this year. The figs are early. The governor is in a thoughtful mood. Drama levels, approximately 0. The real stars of the Aksumite routes, however, were the mountain paths. These twisted up the highlands with that special kind of confidence only ancient trails have. The kind that ignores your preference for flat terrain and instead drags you sideways across a ridge that offers both incredible views and mild existential dread. Couriers handled these routes with steady calmness. They knew every turn that tightened too quickly, every ridge where wind funneled like a melodramatic choir, every narrow ledge where camels walked with the slow, careful footsteps of creatures who knew perfectly well they were balancing a human's important message and their own stubborn dignity. Camel balance, by the way, is underrated. These animals could cross slanted terraces like they were strolling across a palace courtyard. Then there were the carved steps. Yes, the Aksumite carved steps, small, cut by hand, wedged into steep inclines, usually uneven enough to make modern hikers question their life choices. But to Aksumite travelers, they were simply the steps. Reliable, eternal, present. Some were carved so long ago that their edges had softened into gentle curves, like the landscape had decided to hug them. Couriers climbed them in peaceful silence, letting the rhythm of step, pause, carry them upward. They didn't rush. Rushing was for people without taste. One especially interesting part of the Aksumite road system is how it handled rainfall. In some regions, sudden downpours could turn a gentle path into a sloped river about 20 seconds after the first drop. So Aksumite planners carved side channels into the stone or earth, tiny gullies that whisked rainwater away before it could transform the road into an accidental slip and slide. These channels were so discreet that many travelers never noticed them, which was the point. Aksumite engineering preferred to be invisible. If you noticed the road, it meant the road had failed. If you didn't notice it, everything was perfect. This is the exact opposite of modern urban planning, which often wants you to admire the infrastructure loudly and publicly. Aksum didn't need admiration, just functionality. Because their roads blended into the land, the empire didn't have to commit armies of workers to maintenance. Instead, responsibilities were scattered in quiet, informal ways. A shepherd might clear clogged drainage. A merchant passing through might move a fallen branch. A resident might tamp down a loose patch of dirt. A courier might report a muddy slope that needed smoothing. No one issued commands. The work simply happened as a side effect of people using the roads and liking them to stay usable. Aksum treated infrastructure like a shared garden. You tend it because it's comforting to keep things tidy. One of the most enchanting layers of these roads lies in the psychological geography of couriers. They didn't navigate by maps, not even by landmarks in the way travelers sometimes do today. They navigated by memory of motion. A certain rise in the path meant you were an hour from a spring. A particular wind shift meant a valley lay just ahead. A faint scent of a certain wild shrub told you the next settlement was near. Couriers moved through the land the way one moves through a familiar house at night, by feel, by sound, by patterns internalized until they became instinct. This is why Aksumite routes didn't need to be straight. Straight roads are for people navigating by geometry. Aksumites navigated by relationship. Let's drift down now to the lowland routes, long, warm plains where the roads became wider and softer. These stretched like gentle ribbons across rolling terrain, marked not by stones or signs but by the footsteps of countless travelers before. On these plains, couriers didn't need to watch their footing as much. Instead, they watched the sky. the color of heat, the slow build of clouds, the thin shimmer that signaled distant water. Some sections had trees that grew in straightish lines along the road, shaped by wind and occasional human pruning. These created shady corridors that felt like nature's version of rest stops. But the real lowland heroes were the cisterns, deep, stone-lined, sometimes covered with woven mats to keep them cool. These older-than-memory water points kept couriers alive through the driest months. They were maintained with communal reverence. Not sacred, exactly, just essential. You don't disrespect the thing that keeps your camels happy. And then there was the Red Sea Road, the meandering coastal path from the highlands down to Adulis. This road dropped in elevation quickly, transitioning from cool breezes to warm humidity in what felt like a single stretch of steep descent. Couriers often described it as the road where air changes its mind. It passed through villages, fishing settlements, merchant clusters, and the outskirts of Adulis where warehouses, docks, smells, and arguments blended together in a cheerful fog of activity. This was one of the few places where Aksumite roads connected to the wider world without pause. Goods arrived from Arabia, India, and farther along the sea routes. Travelers came with stories so dramatic and loud that couriers often blinked at them slowly, as if adjusting to a different genre of humanity. And when they were done delivering their messages, they retreated back inland, grateful for mountains, silence, and the predictable temperament of dry air. What ties all these routes together is how seamlessly they supported the camel mail system without being built for it in a modern sense. The empire didn't design a network and then impose it. Instead, it folded communication into the living geography. Roads were paths. Paths were habits. Habits became infrastructure. All without fanfare, government expenditure reports, or overly enthusiastic urban planners trying to justify their budgets. This gentle, self-adjusting system held the empire together for centuries. Messages glided through valleys and across ridges. Couriers drifted like patient dots on the landscape. Camels walked with their usual grumpy grace. And the roads? The roads simply existed, soft, ancient, quietly perfect for the task. Alongside the camel mail system flowed another quiet river, trade. Not the dramatic kind of trade with shouted bids and crowded docks. The Aksumite trade network was calm, methodical, and surprisingly integrated with the mail routes. Merchants didn't rush. They measured distance, goods, and opportunity with the same patience as a courier measures the mood of a camel. Markets sprouted naturally along the paths, sometimes in villages, sometimes at crossroads, sometimes in small clearings near wells or shaded groves. These weren't bustling city bazaars with noise and chaos. They were low-key, functional, and slightly predictable. You could arrive on a market day, nod politely, exchange goods, and leave, all while observing the steady rhythm of life. The merchants themselves were an interesting mix of personalities. Some were quiet, meticulous record keepers who measured grain by weight and patience by hours. Others were more inclined to gentle storytelling, recounting long trade trips across hills and deserts, but never in a way that demanded attention. The Aksumite style of commerce encouraged understatement. Bragging about profits was frowned upon. The proper way to demonstrate success was simply to appear content, with goods balanced neatly on a camel or in a small wagon. Merchants often traveled in small groups with camels carrying both trade goods and messages. It was practical. A single camel might carry salt from the coast and a message from a governor at the same time. Slow, steady, and unobtrusive. The integration of commercial and bureaucratic movement meant that trade and communication reinforced each other quietly, like two streams merging into a river without fanfare. Goods themselves ranged widely. Highland farmers offered grains, teff, barley, and wheat, sometimes complemented with butter or honey. Lowland herders contributed goats, sheep, and camels. Coastal traders brought textiles, glass beads, spices, and occasionally imported metals from Arabia, India, or even as far as Rome. The diversity of goods reflected the geography of Aksum itself, a kingdom where mountains, plains, and coastline interacted seamlessly. The careful flow of trade depended on predictability. Merchants timed departures around weather, camel moods, and local rhythms. They coordinated with lodging stations for overnight rest and with water cisterns to keep animals hydrated. Couriers often shared this knowledge, passing along subtle tips: which wells were full, which paths were smooth, which families along the road might offer a warm meal. Everything operated on a calm feedback loop. Prices were discussed quietly without drama. Haggling was polite. Excessive enthusiasm was discouraged. The typical conversation might unfold like this. Merchant A: I have 10 jars of honey. Merchant B: I will trade 2 goats and 3 measures of grain. Merchant A: accepted. No shouts, no exaggerated gestures, just the gentle exchange of value. The quietness was intentional. It reduced tension, made trade easier to predict, and allowed couriers and merchants to coexist peacefully along the same roads. Beyond commerce, these interactions also allowed news to circulate. Merchants were informal correspondents. A gossip about a crop failure or a political dispute might move ahead of a courier, only to be quietly verified when the next official message arrived. This slowed the spread of misinformation. Chaos didn't propagate because the culture valued calm observation and understatement. Merchants also acted as custodians of logistics. They carried small emergency supplies, patched worn camels' hooves, or repaired ropes and harnesses during long trips. Their experience added a layer of reliability to the road network. A broken wagon wheel didn't become a disaster. It was simply another gently resolved obstacle in a journey defined by patience. Interestingly, merchants also influenced settlement patterns. Successful trading stops became semi-permanent villages. Families settled near crossroads and wells to provide consistent service to passing travelers. Over decades, these clusters of commerce and hospitality helped stabilize the empire's social and economic structure, reinforcing the very networks that allowed camel mail to function reliably. Alongside trade, social interaction occurred subtly. Meals, brief conversation, and minor assistance to travelers formed a gentle web of trust. No one needed to shout, because mutual dependency and predictable behavior ensured cooperation. Couriers, merchants, local residents, and scribes became part of a system where everyone understood their role. Even camels, it seemed, were trained in this social equilibrium, responding best to quiet hands, calm voices, and gentle guidance. As the empire grew, long-distance trade became more sophisticated. Coastal hubs like Adulis connected Aksum to the broader Indian Ocean economy, while inland routes maintained a steady flow of agricultural and pastoral products. Couriers and merchants rarely traveled separately, their paths overlapped, creating a network where commerce and communication complemented each other. Yet even at its most complex, the system preserved the same calm principles. Orders from the king, tax updates, merchant ledgers, and personal letters all moved along the same veins, carried by people who approached their work with gentle diligence. Aksumite society did not reward haste or dramatics. It rewarded consistency, observation, and quiet competence. Over time, the integration of merchants and couriers helped the empire remain resilient. The flow of goods and information mitigated the impact of localized disasters, such as crop shortages or temporary political disputes. Because trade and communication followed the same rhythms, disruptions were absorbed gradually rather than explosively. This slow absorption reinforced the steady, unhurried heartbeat of the empire. One particularly charming aspect of these journeys was the shared culinary experience. Travelers often exchanged small portions of food, dried grains, nuts, dates, or freshly baked bread. These weren't elaborate meals, just modest sustenance, quietly shared in the shade of a tree or beside a well. The act of sharing reinforced social bonds and eased the monotony of long, silent journeys. Animals, particularly camels, played a central role in this network. They were, to put it mildly, grumpy yet dependable. Camels carried goods and messages alike, and their personalities were well known to those who traveled with them. Couriers and merchants learned to anticipate minor acts of rebellion: a camel sitting down mid-path, a refusal to step over a small puddle, or a dramatic sigh at sunrise. These minor theatrical gestures were absorbed with calm patience. Emotional overreaction was considered inefficient. Through these overlapping networks of commerce, communication, and animal stewardship, Aksum maintained a cohesion that belied the empire's vast geography. People rarely realized the complexity of the system because it functioned quietly, predictably, and without the need for spectacle. By understanding this, we can see that Aksumite success relied not on force, speed, or spectacle. It relied on rhythm, on networks of quiet interdependence, on couriers, merchants, and camels who approached their work without drama, and communities who supported them with steady hands and calm attention. This gentle pulse, the combination of slow movement, careful observation, and deliberate social networks, made the empire resilient, cohesive, and surprisingly enduring. Messages reached their destinations. Goods reached their markets. And people, quietly, relied on the steady patterns that connected them all. In the next part, we'll explore the ceremonial side of the Aksumite mail system, how the empire gently signaled authority and prestige through the same unhurried networks, without ever disturbing the calm flow that made everything work. Even in a system defined by patience, quiet movement, and understated efficiency, the Aksumite Empire found ways to signal prestige. Authority wasn't just asserted through soldiers or monumental architecture. Sometimes, it floated softly along the same camel routes that carried messages and trade, leaving a subtle echo of imperial presence. Ceremony, in this context, was never loud. There were no trumpets, no marching bands, no exaggerated displays of grandeur. Instead, prestige was expressed through timing, symbols, and small, deliberate gestures that spoke volumes to those attuned to the network. Let's float into one example, the dispatch of royal correspondence. A king's decree or letter was never sent in haste. The courier carrying it moved with calm authority, chosen for reliability and a mild aura of dignity. When they arrived at a provincial center, the presentation of the document itself was a gentle ceremony. The envelope or clay tablet might be adorned with a carved seal, sometimes with a hint of gold leaf, indicating its origin. That's it. No shouting, no fanfare, just the quiet impression, this is official and it matters. Recipients understood these unspoken cues instantly. The weight of a message, the precision of its seal, and the disciplined demeanor of the courier conveyed authority more effectively than loud pronouncements ever could. Aksumite officials relied on subtlety. They knew that when a courier arrived carrying a royal tablet, the empire itself seemed to have moved gently into the room with them. Festivals and ritual observances occasionally intersected with the mail network. Religious leaders or temple officials might receive dispatches coordinating ceremonial activities, offerings, gatherings, or processions. These communications were rarely urgent in the modern sense. Instead, they were carefully scheduled, arriving in advance so that all participants could prepare without rush. The result was a rhythm that mirrored the natural pace of the empire itself. Couriers were sometimes included in these ceremonial roles. They weren't participants in ritual acts, but their presence carried significance. A message delivered on time, by a recognized and trusted courier, signaled respect for tradition and a smooth, unbroken line of authority. Mistimed or lost messages, conversely, were minor embarrassments. That's why couriers developed meticulous habits of observation, timing, and discretion. Prestige was also projected through the care given to the infrastructure itself. Roads, waystations, and lodges weren't merely functional, they were subtly symbolic. A well-maintained water cistern, a neatly kept rest stop, a shaded path, all conveyed that the empire cared for both people and animals. Travelers and local residents internalized this understated message. The empire exists, it moves steadily, and it supports those who travel its arteries. Even simple signage or carved route markers reinforced prestige. These markers weren't ornamental. They provided orientation, distances, or directions, but the precision and consistency of their placement reflected imperial oversight. A traveler knew, without fanfare, that someone, somewhere, had thought about their journey. That quiet thoughtfulness carried a profound sense of order. Occasionally, luxury or aesthetic considerations entered the system in subtle ways. A particularly important dispatch might be carried in a specially prepared pouch, lined with fine cloth. Rare spices or incense could accompany ceremonial deliveries, their scent hinting at status without overwhelming the senses. Couriers understood the nuance. These small touches were symbols of care and prestige, but they were meant to be felt gently, not flaunted. Even the choice of camels could convey importance. Some royal couriers rode animals that were unusually well-trained, unusually calm, or unusually well-groomed. The effect was quiet, but unmistakable. The empire's attention extended to the smallest details. Status was communicated through refinement and subtle control rather than noise or intimidation. It's fascinating to note how prestige and routine intertwined. Regular, predictable deliveries reinforced authority, while ceremonial or symbolic deliveries highlighted the importance of a particular message. Neither overpowered the other. In fact, the two aspects complemented one another perfectly. Routine created trust, prestige reinforced loyalty. Together, they allowed the Aksumite Empire to project power quietly yet effectively across vast distances. Couriers themselves became semi-ceremonial figures in this system. Their comportment mattered. A steady gaze, unhurried steps, precise handling of messages, these all communicated competence and reliability. In the eyes of officials and common residents alike, a well-trained courier reflected the orderliness and calm authority of the empire itself. Even social interactions along the roads carried ceremonial undertones. When a courier arrived at a village, local residents might greet them with modest respect, a nod, an offering of water, or a lightly prepared snack. These gestures were small but meaningful. They acknowledged the role of the courier, the weight of the message, and, by extension, the presence of imperial authority in an otherwise quiet landscape. Traders, too, participated in this subtle ceremonial culture. Exchanging goods or information with a courier wasn't merely transactional. It was a recognition of interconnectedness. These moments of calm acknowledgement reinforced social hierarchies without overt displays. Everyone understood the network, who carried messages, who maintained roads, who controlled resources. Ceremony was embedded in everyday life, gently and persistently. One of the most enduring aspects of this ceremonial culture was its rhythm. Unlike dramatic processions or theatrical displays, Aksumite prestige moved slowly. Couriers departed at carefully timed intervals. Messages arrived in measured sequences. Roads, waystations, and lodges all maintained their understated order. The result was a system that communicated authority without stress, drama, or urgency. Even mistakes, delays due to weather, camel stubbornness, or human error, were absorbed into the rhythm. A minor delay did not trigger panic. Instead, it was quietly corrected, and the system continued. The calm, deliberate pace of Aksumite operations was itself a statement. The empire's strength lay not in speed or force, but in resilience, observation, and subtle influence. In essence, Aksumite ceremonial culture and prestige were woven seamlessly into the infrastructure of the empire. Roads, stations, messages, and couriers all contributed to a quiet demonstration of power. Authority was not shouted, it was implied through steady, predictable operations. Trust, reliability, and understated presentation created a sense of cohesion and legitimacy that spanned mountains, plains, and coastlines. The combination of functionality and subtlety is what allowed Aksum to maintain its influence over centuries. Couriers, merchants, scribes, and local residents all participated in a gentle system of social and administrative reinforcement. Messages traveled, goods moved, and authority was acknowledged, all without the need for spectacle or excess. And so, as we drift into the quiet evening of the Aksumite Empire, it becomes clear that its strength lay in the calm interplay of communication, trade, infrastructure, and subtle ceremony. Authority wasn't imposed, it was demonstrated, consistently, with gentle precision. The empire thrived not because of speed, flash, or drama, but because it respected rhythm, observation, and patience. Even today, centuries later, we can imagine a courier walking slowly across a mountain pass, camel steady, tablet secure, the wind shifting gently. Along the path, villagers nod in acknowledgement, merchants balance their goods carefully, and the empire's pulse continues, quiet, steady, and timeless. The Aksumite mail system was not only about messages, camels, or carefully maintained roads. It was also about the people who lived alongside it, the couriers, their families, and the local residents whose lives intertwined with this quiet rhythm. Understanding these individuals gives a glimpse into the everyday heartbeat of the empire, where small routines and subtle pleasures mattered as much as imperial decrees. Couriers were rarely solitary figures in the dramatic sense. They often maintained homes and families in villages near key routes. Their personal lives were grounded, quiet, and deeply intertwined with the work they did. Children learned early that a messenger parent was not a figure of whimsy or excitement but of reliability, calmness, and careful attention. Little ones watched as camels were prepared, messages wrapped, and pouches secured. They absorbed patience as a form of inheritance, without anyone ever needing to lecture. Meals at home were simple. Couriers favored foods that traveled well: dried grains, fermented milk, honey, occasionally small fish or preserved meat. Preparation was deliberate, almost ritualistic. A shared meal was a moment of stability before the long stretches of solitary travel. Some couriers enjoyed the occasional storytelling session with family, though even this was subdued. Soft tones, gentle humor, small ironic observations about village life. Loud drama was reserved for theater, not home. Sleep, like food, was carefully managed. Couriers often rested early, waking before dawn to tend camels, check gear, and plan routes for the day. Naps during travel were taken where shade permitted, under a lone tree, beside a stone wall, or on a familiar stretch of highland grass. These moments of rest were precious, practiced with intention, and almost meditative in nature. Community life along the mail routes was equally calm. Villages and small settlements had evolved in tandem with the travel system. Families who had lived along the routes for generations acted as informal caretakers for passing couriers and traders. Wells were maintained, firewood stacked neatly, and small lodgings prepared with subtle care. Hospitality was understated but reliable. Visitors knew what to expect: water, shade, and a place to rest without fuss or obligation. Children in these communities played near the paths, sometimes following a camel in mild curiosity, sometimes racing each other to see who could reach a waystation first. Their games mirrored the rhythm of the routes, gentle, predictable, and occasionally interrupted by the arrival of a messenger. Even at play, the network's presence was quietly acknowledged, teaching the next generation about timing, patience, and respect for those who carried the empire's information. For couriers, the long stretches of solitary travel offered opportunities for reflection. Many developed soft observational skills, noting changes in the landscape, the behavior of animals, and subtle shifts in weather. Some recorded their observations, creating private diaries or marginal notes on tablets, though these were rarely formalized. Their reflections were calm, almost meditative. The shadow of the ridge grows long. The spring is clear. Camels move steadily. Moments like these highlight the rhythm of life along the routes: gentle, attentive, and deeply aligned with the natural environment. Couriers learned to read the land as carefully as they read messages. Their journey was not only logistical but profoundly experiential, a slow communion with geography, climate, and animal behavior. Family and social obligations were maintained despite the long absences. Couriers often returned home for short visits, bringing news from distant regions. These reunions were understated celebrations, quiet exchanges of information, small gifts, and shared meals. Couriers didn't boast of their journeys. They didn't exaggerate dangers or accomplishments. Their stories were calm, precise, and factual, emphasizing continuity over excitement. Spouses and older children often managed the household during absences, coordinating resources, maintaining livestock, and attending to small community responsibilities. This shared structure created interdependence and trust. The courier was absent, but their household functioned smoothly, reflecting the same rhythm and reliability expected of the imperial network itself. Entertainment along the routes was sparse but meaningful. Couriers occasionally sang soft songs while walking or riding, rhythms meant to keep pace with the camels and stave off monotony. The songs were repetitive, hypnotic, and low in volume, more meditative aids than performance art. Nights spent at waystations sometimes involved the sharing of stories with local families, but always gently. Humor was dry and understated. Exaggeration was avoided. The tone mirrored the unhurried nature of the roads themselves. Even moments of challenge, loose rocks, sudden winds, or stubborn animals, were met with calm resourcefulness. Couriers rarely displayed frustration. Instead, minor obstacles were incorporated into the day's rhythm, a momentary pause, a small adjustment, and continued movement. These practices reinforced a mindset of patient observation, steady problem-solving, and resilience, traits that extended into personal and social life as naturally as they guided camels along mountain passes. Animal care was another central aspect of daily life. Camels were not merely beasts of burden, they were companions with recognizable personalities. Couriers learned to interpret subtle gestures, the flick of an ear, a shift in weight, a soft huff of impatience. Feeding, grooming, and walking camels became almost meditative routines, exercises in observation, patience, and gentle authority. A well-cared-for camel was not only more reliable but a reflection of the courier's own discipline and competence. Similarly, livestock kept by households along the route required ongoing attention. Goats, sheep, and occasional cattle had grazing patterns that needed monitoring. Couriers' families balanced their domestic duties with the care of animals, maintaining the delicate equilibrium that allowed both home and imperial network to function smoothly. Healthcare, in the quiet Aksumite style, was preventive rather than dramatic. Minor injuries, digestive issues, or fevers were addressed with herbal remedies, rest, and careful observation. Couriers carried small medical knowledge, passed down through generations: leaves for poultices, teas for digestion, oils for minor wounds. Serious illnesses required patience and communal support. Emergency response was pragmatic and low-key. No spectacle, just careful attention until recovery. Mental well-being was similarly understated. The rhythm of travel, the meditative cadence of hoofbeats, and the consistent structure of daily routines provided a natural framework for calmness and reflection. Couriers and their families developed resilience, patience, and a subtle appreciation for continuity over excitement. One of the most fascinating aspects of life along the routes was the quiet transmission of cultural knowledge. Folk tales, practical wisdom, and local customs traveled alongside goods and messages. Children learned about geography, weather patterns, and local etiquette not from formal schooling, but by observing elders and travelers. This informal education reinforced the network's continuity. Knowledge, like messages and trade goods, moved gently from person to person, generation to generation. The Aksumite approach to life along the mail routes was, in many ways, a model of subtle efficiency. Couriers maintained the empire's communication system while leading lives rooted in observation, patience, and routine. Families and communities supported them with steady hospitality and shared responsibilities. Animals were partners rather than tools. The land itself became a teacher. In all this, the human element, the rhythm of daily life, was inseparable from the empire's logistical sophistication. The slow, calm, and deliberate pace of Aksumite life along its mail routes allowed the empire to function with remarkable consistency. Couriers, merchants, families, and residents created a network that was both practical and humane, resilient yet gentle, sustaining an empire for centuries without the need for spectacle or panic. The Aksumite Empire, vast as it was, understood that no matter how well-trained a courier or carefully maintained a road, human effort alone could not dictate the rhythm of travel. Nature had her own schedule, and the empire learned to move in harmony with it rather than against it. Understanding seasonal cycles, rainfall, wind patterns, temperature shifts, and daylight length was as critical to communication as roads or camels. Couriers and administrators developed a deep, practical knowledge of the seasons. They recognized early and late rains, noting how even minor variations affected water sources, trail conditions, and camel stamina. High rainfall could turn a familiar path into an impassable streambed, while prolonged dry spells made wells dangerously shallow. By carefully timing departures and choosing alternate routes, the Aksumites ensured messages and goods moved steadily even when nature threatened to slow progress. This awareness extended beyond immediate geography. Officials maintained mental calendars of distant regions, noting when winds were favorable for moving toward the coast or when mountain fogs might delay passage. Couriers didn't need written orders for these adjustments. They simply knew the land's moods, developed through years of experience and observation. The result was a kind of anticipatory patience, a rhythm that allowed the empire to function smoothly without urgency or panic. The highland routes, for example, were particularly sensitive to seasonal changes. Early morning fog could make a path slippery, while afternoon sun created sharp temperature swings. Couriers would start their journeys at times carefully chosen to balance coolness, visibility, and camel comfort. Timing became an art form. Leave too early, and you risk frostbite or exhaustion. Leave too late, and winds or heat could slow travel. Lowland and desert edge routes demanded their own adjustments. Dry winds could whip sand into travelers' faces, while sudden rains created temporary floods. Administrators built seasonal flexibility into schedules, allowing messages to be delayed slightly without any loss of coherence in the system. Patience, not urgency, was the guiding principle. Even the coastal paths toward Adulis were affected by seasonal winds and tides. Couriers and merchants knew when sea breezes would be gentle, when humidity might affect camels' endurance, and when coastal fogs could obscure waypoints. Timing trips according to these natural patterns ensured that deliveries arrived consistently, even across hundreds of miles. It also minimized stress for animals and humans alike, creating a calm, predictable pattern of movement across the empire. Seasonal planning extended beyond weather. Agricultural cycles influenced the rhythm of travel and commerce. Grain harvests, fruit ripening, and livestock migrations all intersected with the courier network. Administrators timed the dispatch of tax reports, trade goods, and official correspondence to align with these cycles, ensuring that resources were available where needed. There was no rush. The Aksumites preferred that messages and goods arrived when they could be handled effectively, rather than as soon as possible. Animals, particularly camels, were deeply sensitive to seasonal rhythms. Their health and stamina were affected by temperature, forage availability, and humidity. Couriers knew which camels thrived in certain conditions and adjusted pairings accordingly. A camel that might balk under the heat of the lowlands could be perfect for a mountain pass. Matching animals to terrain and season was a quiet art, relying on observation and experience rather than strict schedules. Human routines were similarly attuned. Couriers adjusted sleep, meals, and travel pace according to seasonal conditions. Cooler seasons allowed for longer stretches of walking during daylight. Hotter periods demanded early departures and frequent rests. Water sources dictated stops, and knowledge of local flora provided emergency fodder or shade. Every decision was informed by the natural environment, creating a rhythm that was simultaneously human and ecological. Seasonal awareness also extended to social and ceremonial life. Festivals, offerings, and religious observances were carefully scheduled to align with agricultural cycles and environmental conditions. Couriers carrying messages about these events ensured that preparations and celebrations occurred smoothly, without rush or disorder. The slow, steady movement of information reinforced social cohesion, linking distant communities through a shared understanding of time and nature. Interestingly, the Aksumites also developed subtle anticipatory systems. They maintained informal registers of expected weather patterns and environmental changes. These were not formal meteorological instruments, but knowledge accumulated over generations. Notes on river swelling, soil moisture, bird migration, and wind shifts. Couriers, merchants, and local residents all contributed observations. This decentralized, gentle system allowed the empire to anticipate challenges without ever formalizing them into rigid schedules. One particularly elegant practice involved the synchronization of rest stops and resource availability with seasonal cycles. Wells, grazing areas, and food caches were maintained proactively based on expected usage. For instance, after heavy rains, administrators might inspect paths prone to mud accumulation, while traders ensured that stored grains would survive humid conditions. Camels' diets were adjusted to match seasonal forage, and couriers knew when to avoid certain paths due to flooding or heat. This level of subtle timing transformed the empire into a system that moved in concert with nature rather than trying to conquer it. Couriers, camels, and humans alike learned to flow with the seasons, reducing stress, increasing reliability, and maintaining a calm operational tempo. Daily life, naturally, followed these rhythms as well. Couriers adjusted waking hours to match daylight and temperature. Meals were timed to maximize energy and minimize disruption. Sleep, short or extended depending on seasonal conditions, became a structured practice rather than a random occurrence. Families and local residents aligned their routines similarly, creating a shared temporal framework that extended across geography. The result was a network that functioned with quiet precision. No one needed to rush. No one needed to shout. Every movement was deliberate, timed to harmonize with environmental, social, and logistical cycles. Efficiency was a byproduct of rhythm, not force. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this seasonal rhythm is how it cultivated mindfulness. Couriers became experts in observation, learning to interpret subtle signs in weather, terrain, and animal behavior. Merchants learned to anticipate changes in supply and demand. Families integrated the empire's cycles into domestic life. In every case, calm attentiveness replaced panic or haste, creating a system resilient to both predictable and unexpected challenges. Even delays, storms, illness, or camel stubbornness were absorbed into the rhythm without drama. Adjustments were made with gentle patience. The network's flexibility was built into its alignment with natural cycles, ensuring continuity over centuries. In sum, seasonal timing was not a mere logistical concern. It was a core principle of the Aksumite approach to life, work, and governance. Aligning human activity with nature's quiet cycles allowed couriers to deliver messages consistently, merchants to trade predictably, and communities to thrive without unnecessary stress. The empire's pulse was slow, steady, and harmonious, a calm interplay of human intention and environmental wisdom. In the next chapter, we'll examine the symbolic and practical role of camels in greater depth, exploring their personalities, daily care routines, and the subtle ways they influenced the rhythm of imperial communication and commerce. If there's one element of the Aksumite mail system that deserves gentle admiration, it's the camels. Not because they were exotic or dramatic, and certainly not because they could carry enormous burdens with heroic effort. No, the camels were quietly indispensable, moving steadily along mountain paths, lowland plains, and desert edges, often reflecting the temperament of the empire itself: patient, reliable, and a little stubborn. Camels were not interchangeable beasts in the Aksumite system. Each animal had a personality, a preferred pace, and subtle quirks that couriers learned to read over months or years. Some camels were naturally calm, excellent for highland paths where footing was precarious and nerves mattered more than strength. Others were more spirited, better suited for long, flat stretches where endurance mattered more than caution. Couriers became almost intimate observers of their animals. They noted subtle shifts: a flick of the ear, a change in tail position, the way a hoof landed on soft or uneven ground. These details informed decisions about pacing, rest, and path selection. Aksumite messaging and trade were effective not despite the camels, but because of them. The animals were partners, not tools. Daily routines for camels were surprisingly structured. Feeding was predictable: dry grass, occasional grains, water at regular intervals. Rest periods were carefully timed. Animals were brushed or rubbed down, hoofs inspected, and harnesses adjusted for comfort. A minor injury was addressed immediately: pulled tendon, a small cut, or an irritation from a poorly fitted strap. Couriers knew that even a minor grievance could slow progress if left unattended. Interestingly, camels were also sensitive to human emotion and routine. Calm, patient handling encouraged steady behavior, while impatience or harsh treatment often provoked resistance. The relationship was symbiotic. The courier maintained the animal, and the animal, in turn, ensured the reliability of the system. Traveling along mountain paths, A courier's camel might navigate narrow ledges with apparent thoughtfulness. In these stretches, the animal's balance, experience, and temperament mattered more than strength. A hesitant step could delay the journey. A confident stride could accelerate it slightly, though speed was rarely the point. The goal was always steady, predictable progress. Lowland and desert routes highlighted endurance and temperament differently. Heat, sand, and long distances tested patience. Camels often responded by adjusting gait, seeking shade where available, or refusing minor commands. Couriers learned to anticipate these behaviors, pacing travel, offering rest, or adjusting loads as necessary. Even minor impatience could create inefficiency. Calm observation was the key to long-term success. Camel care extended beyond the practical into the ceremonial, in subtle ways. Especially important or royal messages might be carried by animals groomed more carefully than usual, with minor decorative touches such as dyed ropes or small cloth embellishments. These weren't ostentatious. They didn't announce authority loudly. They simply signaled care, attentiveness, and a gentle elevation of importance. Observers understood. The empire's attention extended even to the humblest of couriers and their animals. Camels also facilitated social cohesion. Their care involved family members and community residents, creating informal networks of mutual responsibility. Villages along the routes often knew which animals were coming and prepared water and fodder in advance. Couriers, camels, and local residents participated in a shared rhythm of observation and care, reinforcing trust and smooth operation across the network. Behavioral training for camels was calm but consistent. Repetition, patience, and gentle correction were the methods of choice. Animals learned preferred paces, the limits of their loads, and subtle responses to verbal or tactile cues. Training emphasized predictability over performance. An obedient, calm camel was more valuable than a fast or flashy one. Interestingly, couriers developed minor traditions of recognizing and naming their animals. A camel might be known for its stubbornness on steep paths, its careful footing in sand, or its endurance on long, hot plains. Names and reputations were shared quietly among couriers, often accompanied by small ironic or affectionate comments. Nubru prefers rocks under his feet but hates soft dirt. Zara believes she is royalty and must be treated accordingly. These observations were practical and humanizing, helping maintain a sense of connection and care across long journeys. Rest periods were synchronized with both human and camel needs. Couriers selected shaded areas, near wells or grazing spots, and timed meals to match the animal's digestion cycles. Camels often rested standing, occasionally lying down, while couriers performed minor maintenance, checked loads, or observed the landscape. The rhythm of travel became intertwined with the rhythm of life for both human and animal. Even the social dimension of camel care was significant. Villagers along the route sometimes assisted in feeding, grooming, or minor adjustments. Children might walk alongside a camel, learning its temperament and observing travel routines. These interactions reinforced the communal dimension of the Aksumite system. The movement of messages, goods, and animals depended on quiet cooperation and mutual respect. Camels' intelligence was also harnessed subtly. They recognized familiar paths, rest stops, and minor hazards. Experienced animals could adjust gait for slippery rocks, avoid certain obstacles, or anticipate terrain changes. Couriers leveraged this knowledge, trusting animals' instincts and integrating them into journey planning. The result was a cooperative system in which human and animal cognition worked together, quietly ensuring reliability. Interestingly, camels could also communicate discomfort or danger. A low hum, a sudden stop, or a particular tail movement alerted the courier to potential problems, a rocky patch, a steep incline, or exhaustion. These subtle signals reduced accidents, improved efficiency, and reinforced the importance of patient observation. Couriers who ignored these cues often found themselves delayed or frustrated, reinforcing the value of mindfulness. In ceremonial contexts, camels could subtly project status. Animals carrying royal or important messages were treated with extra care, sometimes traveling slightly ahead of other pack animals, or given preferred grazing and water. Their presence announced the importance of a message without overt spectacle. This quiet signaling, combined with the careful grooming and harnessing of the animal, created a nonverbal language of respect, reliability, and imperial attention. Overall, camels were more than vehicles. They were partners, companions, and gentle arbiters of rhythm. Their temperament shaped human routines, their needs dictated pacing, and their subtle behaviors communicated environmental realities. The empire's mail system, trade networks, and ceremonial routines were inseparable from these animals' steady presence. Through careful observation, patient handling, and quiet care, couriers maintained the health, stamina, and reliability of their camels. In return, camels enabled a network that spanned mountains, plains, and deserts, sustaining communication, trade, and governance across centuries. The next chapter will explore the scribes, record keepers, and administrative minds behind the scenes, the quiet coordinators who ensured that messages, goods, and resources flowed seamlessly across the empire, often without ever leaving their desks. If couriers were the hands and camels the legs of the Aksumite communication system, then scribes were its quiet, watchful brains. They didn't traverse mountains or coax stubborn animals. Instead, they orchestrated the flow of messages, trade records, and official decrees from the safety of shaded rooms, cool stone chambers, or modest huts near key waystations. Their work was precise, patient, and largely invisible, but without it, the empire's gentle rhythm would have unraveled. Scribes were trained from childhood, often apprenticed within families or guilds that specialized in record keeping. They developed a calm, almost meditative approach to writing. Ink was prepared carefully, reeds sharpened, tablets cleaned, and mistakes corrected with understated care. Nothing was rushed. A hurried scribe was a risk to the empire, and Aksumites valued steady precision over speed or flamboyance. Their responsibilities were varied. Couriers brought messages that needed transcription, verification, or replication. Trade records arrived detailing the movement of goods along the same paths. Tax assessments, legal decisions, and ritual instructions required accurate documentation. Each entry had to be consistent, clear, and quietly authoritative. The scribe's pens or styluses conveyed not only information but a sense of continuity, reliability, and imperial oversight. The daily routine of a scribe was structured but calm. Mornings were devoted to reviewing messages, checking for errors, and organizing tablets or scrolls according to importance and destination. Midday might involve preparing dispatches for the next courier arrival or recording trade activity at local markets. Afternoons were often spent copying texts or consulting older records to ensure consistency. Interestingly, scribes operated almost entirely on memory and habit. Familiarity with common phrasing, official formats, and procedural requirements allowed them to work fluidly. Mistakes were minimized not by frantic double-checking but by the steady rhythm of routine and observation. A scribe's calm attention to detail mirrored the patient steps of the couriers they supported. Some scribes also acted as informal advisors. Their knowledge of records, trade flows, and communication patterns made them valuable in decision-making. A governor might consult a scribe to understand which routes were congested, which regions were experiencing shortages, or which messages required priority attention. Scribes rarely offered dramatic warnings. Instead, they presented information quietly, allowing leaders to make decisions with foresight and calm. The environment in which scribes worked reflected their philosophy: cool, shaded rooms, minimal distractions, orderly storage of tablets, scrolls, and writing implements. Noise was discouraged. Conversations were soft. Even the arrangement of furniture was practical, emphasizing efficiency and ease of observation over grandeur. A scribe's workspace was a sanctuary of focus and continuity, supporting the smooth functioning of the empire from a single vantage point. Scribes also played a subtle role in ceremonial signaling. When a royal message or decree was dispatched, the tablet or scroll often bore marks indicating its origin and priority. These markings were standardized, precise, and quietly authoritative. The recipient could interpret them immediately, understanding the gravity of the communication without the need for fanfare. Scribes maintained these codes, ensuring consistency and preserving the understated elegance of imperial authority. Training future scribes was a careful process. Apprentices observed the work of experienced scribes for years, gradually absorbing routines, formatting conventions, and the subtle rhythms of Aksumite administration. Mistakes were corrected gently. Emphasis was placed on continuity rather than speed or flair. By the time an apprentice was considered competent, they had internalized not just the mechanics of writing but the philosophy of calm, deliberate administration. Scribes also collaborated closely with merchants and local officials. Trade records, tax assessments, and correspondence intersected at the scribe's desk. By maintaining accurate, clear, and consistent documentation, scribes allowed goods and messages to flow predictably. Traders could anticipate arrivals and deliveries. Officials could plan resource allocation. Couriers could follow established routes with confidence. The network relied on their quiet diligence as much as on camels or roads. Even mistakes were handled with understated care. A miswritten number or unclear mark did not trigger panic. Scribes corrected errors calmly, noting adjustments in a methodical manner. Redundant copies of critical records were often maintained, ensuring resilience without drama. In a system designed for steady reliability, overreaction was considered counterproductive. Patience, observation, and consistency were the true measures of competence. The scribes' influence extended to the broader culture of the empire. Their emphasis on precision, observation, and calm authority subtly shaped the mindset of those they interacted with: couriers, officials, merchants, and residents alike. By modeling deliberate attention and quiet competence, scribes reinforced the empire's core values: predictability, reliability, and understated coordination. Interestingly, scribes often developed minor personal habits to support focus and well-being. Soft music like humming, careful stretching, and periodic observation of sunlight patterns were common. These small practices minimized fatigue and maintained rhythm. A steady scribe produced better records, which in turn maintained the smooth operation of couriers, traders, and administrators across vast distances. Beyond official documentation, scribes occasionally recorded informal observations, weather patterns, road conditions, unusual events, or notable behaviors of travelers and animals. These marginal notes were rarely ceremonial or dramatic, but they provided subtle guidance for future operations. Over generations, this accumulated knowledge became an unspoken repository of wisdom, quietly guiding the empire's logistical and administrative decisions. In many ways, scribes were the unsung rhythm keepers of Aksum. While couriers moved along mountain paths and camels carried messages across deserts and plains, scribes ensured that each tablet, scroll, and note fit seamlessly into a coherent system. Their patience, consistency, and subtle authority maintained a balance that allowed the empire to function smoothly over centuries. Even today, imagining a scribe at work, quietly, meticulously, in a shaded room with a gentle breeze stirring dust motes, offers insight into the human dimension of the empire's enduring success. Without them, the calm rhythm of couriers, camels, merchants, and villages might have fractured, leaving the empire vulnerable to disorder. By integrating careful observation, deliberate timing, and subtle coordination, scribes transformed everyday documentation into a foundational pillar of imperial stability. Their work demonstrates that empire building is not only about roads, armies, or grand monuments. Sometimes, the quiet, persistent attention of a few dedicated individuals, scribes hunched over ink and tablets, can sustain a civilization for centuries. The next chapter will drift into the quiet yet complex networks of taxation, resource management, and supply chains, the hidden systems that allowed Aksum to maintain infrastructure, support couriers, and sustain trade without ever disturbing the calm, steady pulse of the empire. Alongside couriers, camels, and scribes, the Aksumite Empire relied on another quietly essential system: the hidden networks of supply and taxation. Unlike grand armies or monumental architecture, this system operated without fanfare. It was steady, predictable, and invisible to those outside the loop. but it was fundamental for keeping roads maintained, animals fed, and messages flowing across mountains, plains, and coasts. Taxation in Aksum was understated yet meticulously organized. Residents along trade routes, villages near waystations, and even semi-nomadic communities contributed to a system that ensured the empire's material needs were met without disrupting daily life. There was no aggressive collection or public spectacle. Instead, local officials and scribes coordinated quietly, balancing the needs of the state with the realities of community life. Most taxes were collected in kind rather than coin. Grain, livestock, or other goods were contributed according to established quotas. These contributions fed waystations, supported couriers, and maintained camels. Excessive demands were avoided, as officials understood that overtaxing would disrupt the delicate rhythm of travel and trade. Predictability and fairness were more valuable than speed or profit. The supply system extended to everything a courier or camel might need: food, water, bedding, and minor medical supplies. Waystations were stocked based on anticipated traffic, informed by scribes' records, seasonal patterns, and previous year's observations. This quiet planning ensured that couriers rarely lacked essentials and that camels remained healthy and dependable. Even minor adjustments were carefully managed. A drought might require temporary redistribution of grain or forage. A particularly busy trade season might necessitate small increases in water or shelter along routes. These adjustments were communicated subtly, usually through scribes or trusted local officials, avoiding any sudden disruption or public alarm. Village residents played a significant role in sustaining these networks. They provided food, water, and lodging to passing couriers, often in exchange for small incentives or simply as part of communal responsibility. Hospitality was not ostentatious, it was methodical and consistent. A passing courier might notice the same family providing a clean resting spot year after year, reinforcing trust and continuity across generations. This human element was central. The empire's logistics were only as reliable as the people who maintained them. Couriers, scribes, local officials, and residents all participated in an interdependent system where each person's actions contributed to the smooth functioning of the whole. The beauty of this system was that it relied on calm cooperation rather than force or spectacle. Supplies were often prepositioned along routes, a quiet network of caches and waypoints. These were carefully monitored by local administrators, who adjusted quantities based on seasonal patterns, road conditions, and anticipated courier traffic. Camels, accustomed to these stops, approached them predictably, allowing for minor rest, feeding, and adjustments to loads. The system functioned as an almost invisible infrastructure, connecting human, animal, and environmental rhythms. Trade and taxation intersected seamlessly. Merchants carrying goods along the same routes as couriers contributed to local economies, indirectly supporting supply chains. Grain from one village might be redistributed to a way station, while a portion of a caravan's load funded minor repairs along the road. These exchanges were quiet, systematic, and self-reinforcing. Everyone along the path understood their role, and deviation was rare. Infrastructure maintenance was similarly embedded within the network. Roads were repaired proactively, wells cleaned and refilled, and shelters maintained. Labor was organized subtly, often through local communities contributing time or resources. Couriers rarely noticed any dramatic effort. The infrastructure simply remained functional, allowing travel to proceed smoothly. This quiet attention to detail reinforced the empire's reliability and authority without overt control or force. Interestingly, the Aksumites incorporated redundancy into their supply networks. Multiple wells, alternative paths, and secondary caches ensured that minor disruptions, floods, broken bridges, or stubborn camels did not derail the system. These redundancies were integrated quietly, without fanfare, creating resilience through careful observation and subtle planning rather than dramatic intervention. Communication and record-keeping were critical. Scribes maintained detailed accounts of tax collection, resource distribution, and route conditions. Couriers carried updated information, allowing local administrators to adjust allocations efficiently. Even small delays or shortages could be managed gracefully thanks to the steady flow of reliable data. Again, drama was avoided. The system's strength lay in predictability and careful observation. The seasonal rhythms discussed in the previous chapter directly influenced supply and taxation strategies. During harvest periods, surplus grains were stored for redistribution. During dry seasons, water and fodder were carefully rationed. Couriers and camels moved according to these cycles, ensuring minimal strain on both human and animal participants. The empire's planning was harmonized with natural patterns, demonstrating a subtle but sophisticated understanding of timing and resource management. Social norms reinforced these networks. Generosity, cooperation, and reliability were highly valued. Families who consistently supported passing couriers and maintained resources were respected and subtly rewarded. Conversely, communities that failed to meet obligations quietly risked delays in service or minor administrative attention. Punishment was rarely dramatic. Subtle social and logistical incentives maintained compliance. Even ceremonial aspects were integrated into this system. Royal messages, religious decrees, or festival-related instructions were considered high priority in distribution and supply. They often received preferential treatment in routing, accommodation, and provisioning, but again, quietly. The empire projected prestige and authority without disrupting the calm operational flow. Ultimately, the hidden networks of supply and taxation were the unsung backbone of the Aksumite Empire. They allowed couriers to move predictably, camels to remain healthy, scribes to maintain accurate records, and merchants to trade reliably. Everyone and everything functioned in concert, guided by patient observation, deliberate timing, and understated coordination. This quiet orchestration demonstrates that empire building is not only about dramatic battles or monumental architecture. Sometimes, stability and endurance arise from subtle, persistent attention to human, animal, and environmental rhythms. Aksum thrived for centuries not through force or spectacle, but through patience, observation, and an unwavering commitment to steady, predictable function. In the next chapter, we will explore the international dimensions of Aksum's system, how distant trade partners, foreign envoys, and maritime connections integrated with the camel routes and supply networks, maintaining calm global interactions without disrupting the empire's serene internal rhythm. While the Aksumite Empire's internal network of couriers, scribes, camels, and supply chains ensured calm and consistent governance across mountains and plains, its influence reached beyond the highlands into distant horizons. Maritime connections and interactions with foreign powers were another layer of the empire's quiet sophistication, a network that operated smoothly without fanfare, relying on observation, timing, and subtle coordination. Adulis, the principal port on the Red Sea, functioned as the empire's interface with the wider world. Ships arrived from India, Arabia, and the Mediterranean, carrying goods, messages, and occasionally envoys. Despite the potential chaos of maritime trade, the Aksumites maintained a remarkably calm system. Arrival and departure schedules were carefully planned according to seasonal winds, tides, and weather conditions. Couriers from inland hubs synchronized with port operations, ensuring that messages, goods, and resources moved in a steady, predictable rhythm. Merchants and port officials developed informal but precise protocols for handling arrivals. Ships were inspected, cargo was recorded, and goods were distributed or stored according to pre-established procedures. Noise, spectacle, or competitive chaos was minimized. The goal was consistent throughput, ensuring that commerce and communication continued without stress, delay, or confusion. Even foreign traders learned to respect this understated efficiency, aligning their arrivals with local schedules rather than forcing disruption. Long-distance correspondence added another layer of complexity. Envoys and letters from foreign powers often arrived at the port, requiring careful handling by scribes and officials. Messages were logged, sealed, and dispatched inland with reliable couriers. Timing was essential. Seasonal winds dictated ship arrivals, and inland roads and camel networks required careful scheduling. The Aksumites' approach emphasized calm precision over haste. A delayed or mismanaged message was considered an avoidable inconvenience, not a catastrophic failure. Trade goods flowed alongside messages. Exotic items such as ivory, spices, and textiles were cataloged meticulously by scribes. Camels transported cargo from ports to inland markets, resting at established waystations. Local administrators ensured that resources were allocated effectively: fodder for animals, storage for goods, and food and lodging for travelers. Every step was integrated into the larger rhythm of the empire, blending human, animal, and environmental considerations seamlessly. Diplomatic relations also followed this understated rhythm. Envoys from Arabia or India were received with formal respect but minimal spectacle. Meetings were organized according to both protocol and practical timing, ensuring that messages, gifts, or trade agreements were processed efficiently. Couriers often accompanied envoys inland, maintaining the flow of information without fanfare. The empire projected authority subtly, demonstrating organization and reliability rather than pomp. Maritime timing was similarly sensitive to seasonal and environmental patterns. The monsoon winds dictated sailing schedules, while coastal currents and tides influenced port logistics. The Aksumites integrated this knowledge with inland rhythms. Couriers timed departures to match expected ship arrivals. Scribes prepared records in advance, and waystations along inland routes were provisioned accordingly. The result was a system that seemed effortless but relied on careful observation, patience, and coordination. Interestingly, foreign traders and envoys often contributed to this quiet efficiency. They adjusted cargo, timing, and behavior to align with local expectations, subtly reinforcing the empire's rhythm. Over time, repeated interactions created a shared understanding. The Aksumite system operated on calm precision, and those who respected it benefited from predictability and reliability. Disruptions were minimized because everyone involved understood the understated rules of the network. Cultural exchange followed the same gentle pattern. Ideas, religious practices, and technologies arrived via maritime connections, recorded by scribes and transported inland by couriers. These transmissions were integrated slowly, without forcing sudden change. Communities absorbed new practices at a measured pace, maintaining continuity while benefiting from innovation. Even cross-cultural interaction was deliberate, calm, and rhythmically aligned with broader imperial systems. The port of Adulis also supported minor ceremonial activities, reflecting both prestige and operational coordination. Royal decrees or messages accompanying visiting envoys might be given subtle enhancements: carefully sealed tablets, small decorative touches on cargo, or slightly prioritized handling. The message was quiet but clear. The empire maintained authority and attention even across distant horizons. Nothing dramatic was needed. Precision, predictability, and careful observation communicated power more effectively than spectacle. Even mundane port operations, loading and unloading goods, maintaining storage facilities, or managing customs, followed established rhythms. Workers and administrators knew when ships arrived, how long unloading would take, and which resources would be needed along inland routes. Camels were assigned cargo, couriers were dispatched, and scribes maintained records. Every step was predictable, coordinated, and understated, ensuring a seamless transition from sea to land. The empire also developed contingency strategies for maritime disruptions. Storms, delayed winds, or damaged ships were accounted for in planning. Alternative routes, additional storage, and flexible courier schedules allowed the system to absorb irregularities without panic. The Aksumites' calm approach meant that even potentially chaotic events were managed gracefully, reinforcing the sense of stability and reliability that underpin the empire's operations. Interestingly, the integration of maritime and inland networks fostered a subtle global awareness. Couriers and scribes tracked arrivals and departures, seasonal winds, and foreign envoys' activities. This quiet accumulation of knowledge informed decisions about trade, taxation, and logistics. The empire's reach was not asserted through force or intimidation, but through the predictable, steady flow of information and goods. Even cultural rhythms were subtly reinforced. Religious practices, festival schedules, and ceremonial observances occasionally incorporated foreign influences, timed carefully to align with internal cycles. Couriers delivered instructions, scribes recorded details, and communities observed the events with gentle attention. Prestige, authority, and cultural integration were communicated not through spectacle, but through timing, consistency, and quiet organization. Ultimately, Aksum's maritime connections illustrate the empire's ability to extend its rhythm beyond immediate territory. By synchronizing inland and coastal operations, observing environmental and seasonal cycles, and maintaining calm coordination, the empire achieved reliability on a regional and international scale. Authority and prestige were communicated subtly through order, timing, and attention to detail rather than overt displays. In essence, the distant horizons of Aksum were integrated seamlessly into the empire's broader systems. Couriers, camels, scribes, administrators, and villagers all contributed to a network that extended across land and sea, maintaining calm, predictable operations. Trade, communication, and diplomacy proceeded without unnecessary drama, allowing the empire to thrive for centuries. While couriers, camels, scribes, and administrators maintained the calm internal pulse of the Aksumite Empire, traders formed a subtly dynamic link between local production, inland markets, and distant maritime connections. Their lives were rarely dramatic in the way history loves to record. No heroic battles, no sweeping conquests, but their daily routines reveal a quiet, intricate dance that kept the empire's economic and social systems aligned. Merchants typically specialized in specific goods: ivory from the highlands, spices from southern ports, gold dust, textiles, or exotic imports from India and Arabia. Their role was not simply transactional. It was logistical, observational, and deeply rhythmic. Timing mattered more than speed. The arrival of a caravan or ship had to coincide with seasonally available resources, waystation capacity, and inland storage. Traders learned to move with patience and foresight, attuned to both the empire's internal rhythm and the external world's pace. A trader's day began early, usually before dawn. Preparations involved inventory checks, securing camels, and reviewing the route for potential obstacles. Couriers' schedules and scribes' records were consulted to ensure alignment with the wider network. Even minor misalignment, a delayed caravan or a dry well, could ripple through the system, slowing not only trade but also communications and resource distribution. Merchants learned that careful planning and quiet observation mattered more than forceful action or urgency. Travel was steady rather than dramatic. Merchants often walked alongside their camels, keeping a calm, deliberate pace. Load management was critical. Too heavy, and animals fatigued. Too light, and efficiency was wasted. Stops at waystations were brief but structured. Animals were fed, water was measured, and minor repairs were carried out on gear. Traders rarely wasted words or energy. Focus, attention to detail, and a subtle appreciation for rhythm defined the journey. Along inland routes, merchants interacted with local communities in understated ways. Villagers provided water, food, and temporary shelter, often in exchange for small goods or simply as part of customary hospitality. Traders respected these systems, leaving resources undisturbed and maintaining predictable conduct. Over time, repeated interactions reinforced mutual trust. Villages knew which traders to expect, and traders relied on local knowledge to navigate terrain and social norms. In coastal ports, merchants adapted to maritime rhythms. Arrival and departure schedules were dictated by monsoon winds, tides, and the readiness of local officials. Ships were loaded with goods, inscriptions verified by scribes, and minor adjustments made to cargo in accordance with scribes' records. Trading was meticulous, quiet, and aligned with environmental and administrative cycles. Drama was unnecessary. Precision, patience, and subtle negotiation ensured efficiency.